Sign it. I refuse to let a nobody in a surplus jacket become a burden on our billionaire in-laws for the rest of her life. My mother said that in the middle of Christmas dinner, sliding a white envelope across the table until it stopped in front of my plate. Stamped across the front, in bold letters, Renunciation of family rights. She looked at my worn field jacket the way you'd look at something tracked in on a shoe. She wanted me erased before I could stand in the way of my sister's climb into old money. She was certain I was nothing. She had no idea the daughter she was humiliating was a major general in the United States Air Force, and the only person alive holding the keys to everything our family owned. I didn't cry. My hands, marked by 28 years of service, opened that envelope slowly. And 2 minutes later, what I put on that table left my mother sitting in absolute silence. To understand how we got there, you have to go back a full year, to the day the rot started. It began the afternoon my younger sister brought home the son of the Ashford banking family. Within days, my mother started stripping our house of anything that looked ordinary, chasing the appearance of old money she'd never actually had. She pulled my framed service commendation off the wall and boxed it up in the garage, replacing it with a painting bought on credit. Nearly 3 decades of my career went from something she mentioned occasionally to something she refused to acknowledge at all. She stopped introducing me at her country club lunches. I watched her max out a 3rd credit card on a handbag she couldn't afford, cut the tag off with her teeth, and practice holding it in the mirror for the better part of an hour. She told my sister to say I was stationed overseas indefinitely, simpler than explaining a daughter in combat boots. I found the script for that lie taped inside a kitchen cabinet, right next to a list of her future in-laws' favorite wines. She was building a fortress out of borrowed prestige, and I was the crack she couldn't plaster over. The first real fracture came 8 months before that Christmas table, at a quiet, expensive restaurant downtown. I sat across from my mother in plain boots and an unmarked shirt. An older waitress named Irene approached with a heavy tray of water glasses, her hands shaking from what was clearly the back half of a double shift. As she leaned in to set one down, the tray tipped slightly, and a few drops landed on my mother's sleeve. I reached for a napkin. My mother knocked my hand away hard enough to leave a mark, then stood so fast her chair screeched across the floor. She leaned over the table and pointed straight into Irene's face. "Do you know what this blouse costs? Get your manager. Fire her." Her voice cut across the whole restaurant, and every table went silent. Irene apologized through tears, explaining she had a sick grandchild at home relying on her wages. I reached for my wallet to make it right. My mother snatched the bills out of my hand before I could hand them over, and looked at me like she expected my silence as payment. I didn't argue in front of that room. I filed it away instead, the cruelty in her eyes, the shame on Irene's face, as proof of exactly who my mother had become. I sat back down, took a slow breath, held it, let it go, the same discipline that had kept me steady in places far more dangerous than that dining room. In that moment, my mother stopped being family to me and became something to be managed. I decided to let her keep digging. Her need for status would eventually bury her without any help from me. The truth was, her whole picture of my poverty was fiction. The people who looked at my dented truck with pity had no idea who was behind the wheel. The woman eating takeout alone in a drafty rental outranked most of the room at that dinner. My salary alone outpaced her fabricated image of wealth several times over, and that wasn't counting what my father had quietly left behind. I gave orders that mattered to people whose names never made the news. But none of that was the real source of my power. That lived inside a fireproof box under my floorboards, in one sealed document that could end my family's financial life with a single signature. 6 years before, my father lay dying in a cold hospital room, a monitor counting down what was left of him. He gripped my hand and told me, with whatever strength he had, to let my mother believe I had nothing. "You'll finally see who she really is," he said. Then, with a shaking hand, he signed control of the entire family trust over to me, not her. He made me repeat the promise twice. 40 seconds later, the monitor went flat. I sat there holding an inheritance I hadn't asked for, and a vow I meant to keep no matter what it cost me. So I played the part. I wore the same tired jacket everywhere. I drove a truck that rattled and refused to trade it in. I let her build her delusion piece by piece without ever correcting it. Every insult, every glance at my boots, went into a ledger I kept in my head. I held the keys to the very kingdom she was chasing, and I never once let her see them. Her vanity kept growing, completely blind to what hung over her. Some nights I sat outside my rental in the cold, fighting the urge to pull out my ID right there at dinner and end the whole charade early. I never did. I treated my civilian life like a long deployment, patient, disciplined, quiet. The trap was already set. I only had to let her walk into it herself. As my sister's wedding got closer, my mother's vanity curdled into something closer to control. She ran the whole event like a hostile merger, obsessing over every detail that might impress her new circle. One evening I sat quietly while she and my sister reviewed the wedding party list on the coffee table. My sister wrote my name at the top with a hopeful little smile. My mother looked at that name like a predator spotting weakness. She pulled the clipboard out of my sister's hands, grabbed a thick red marker from her bag, and drew one hard line straight through my name. My sister flinched. She opened her mouth to argue and my mother silenced her with a look that emptied the room of air. That red line wasn't just an edit. It was my mother formally erasing me. I can't have your rough look in the wedding photos, she told me, sweet and cold in the same breath. You'll sit in the back with the distant cousins. No altar. No speech. No photographers. She wanted to watch me break, wanted me to beg for a seat at my own sister's wedding. I looked past her to my sister, waiting for her to say something. She stayed quiet. I stood, zipped my jacket, and walked out without a word. As the door clicked shut, I heard my sister through the wall, "Sorry for the trouble, Mom," already folding. I filed that away too, and drove home already knowing how this would end. Which brings us back to Christmas. I'd just come off a 30-hour shift and drove my dented truck straight up the Ashford Estates driveway, parking beside a row of gleaming sports cars. I zipped my jacket to my chin on purpose. Walking and looking exactly like what they expected of me was the sharpest move available. The moment I stepped through the doors, the room went quiet. My mother rushed over, heels clicking, and grabbed my arm to steer me toward a side hallway. "Could you not embarrass me tonight, Margaret?" My future sister-in-law's mother, Diana Ashford, stood by the fireplace swirling champagne, looking me over like something tracked in on a shoe. "A bit rustic, isn't it?" she said with a smirk. Their contempt filled the room like smoke. I ignored both of them and looked instead at Charles Ashford, the family patriarch. He didn't look at my jacket. He looked at how I stood. He crossed the room, extended his hand, and I shook it with equal pressure. Something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, maybe, of someone who didn't need to perform. I sat at the far end of the table for the next hour while my mother told Diana, loud enough for me to hear, that she'd begged me not to come. Diana agreed my housekeeper dresses better on her day off, and they laughed together at my expense. I ate quietly and let it happen. When the gift exchange came around, I pulled a small worn box from my jacket and slid it to my sister. Inside was a flattened bullet on a leather cord, the round that had struck my body armor years earlier and saved my life. I'd polished it by hand for years. "I made it myself," I told her. She reached for it, and before she could touch it, my mother snatched it out of the box and held it up like something diseased. "What is this, scrap metal?" She threw it onto the table, where it clattered against the crystal, then pulled a diamond necklace from her bag and pressed it into my sister's hands instead. "This is a real gift," she announced. Diana laughed along with her. Then Charles stood up. The room went silent. He walked past the diamonds without a glance, picked up the bullet, and turned it over in his fingers, running his thumb along the scar in the metal. "This is what real courage looks like," he said, and the room's temperature changed. My mother's face twisted. She couldn't stand losing the spotlight to the daughter she'd spent a year erasing. That's when she reached into her bag one last time and pulled out the sealed white envelope. She slid it across the table and let it stop by my plate. The renunciation contract had arrived. I opened it and read every line: full separation from the family estate, formally barred from ever seeking support, my presence declared a liability. She wanted my signature to finalize my exile, with no idea she was about to sign away everything she had left. I read it without blinking while she leaned forward, practically vibrating, waiting to watch me break. My sister read the words upside down from across the table and shot to her feet, knocking over her wine glass. "Mom, how could you do this to her? She's your daughter." She stepped in front of me, defending me for the first time in her life, voice shaking. My mother yanked her arm back. "Sit down, Paige. This is for your future." I didn't sign. I folded the contract in half, then in half again, and set it beside my plate with my hand resting on top of it. I took a slow sip of water and let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. Then I looked my mother in the eye, not as her daughter, but as someone who'd given orders that mattered. "You're asking what I'm protecting by not signing," I said, flat and even. I reached into my jacket, past the pens, and pulled out my active-duty military ID. I set it down on the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. The Department of Defense seal. My rank, printed clean under my photo. Major General. Diana gasped and dropped her glasses in her lap. My mother stared at the card like it might go off. In an instant, every insult she'd thrown at me all year rearranged itself into something else entirely. Before anyone could recover, I reached into my jacket again and pulled out my father's sealed will, laying it directly on top of the contract. "This is the family trust," I said. "All of it. Every dollar answers to me." My mother went pale and sank back in her chair. The house, the cars, the credit cards funding her fake friendships, all of it had been flowing from money I alone controlled. My father's plan had worked exactly the way he intended. She'd tied the noose herself, in front of the very people she'd been so desperate to impress. I placed both hands flat on the table and leaned forward. "The problem was never who you thought you were protecting. It's who you assumed I was," I told her. She'd assumed kindness meant weakness. She'd assumed my silence meant I had nothing. She was wrong on every count, and now she knew it in front of everyone she'd worked so hard to fool. Then Charles Ashford let out a short, dry laugh that cut through the room. "I was the one who suggested she draft that contract," he said. "I wanted to see if a mother would really sell out her own daughter for appearances. And she did." My sister dropped to her knees, sobbing. My mother sat frozen, stripped of everything, her money, her image, her dignity, in the space of a single dinner. I looked down at her one last time. "Enjoy the wedding," I said. "It's the last dime of mine you'll ever see." Then I zipped my jacket, turned, and walked out into the cold. I didn't look back. The air outside tasted like something close to peace. For 3 days after that, my phone stayed silent. I stayed in my rental, drinking black coffee, doing nothing in particular. My lawyers had already frozen every line of credit tied to her name. Her friends stopped calling within a day. My sister left message after message, each more desperate than the last. I let them all go unanswered. I'd won, but it didn't feel like winning. It just felt heavy. On the 4th morning, there was a knock at my door, faint and hesitant. I opened it to find my mother standing on my porch in the cold, no makeup, no jewelry, wrapped in a thin sweater, having walked a long way to get there. She'd aged years and days. Her nails were broken down to nothing. Her shoes had worn through at the soles. She pulled the torn, tear-stained contract from her pocket and ripped it the rest of the way apart in front of me, letting the pieces scatter in the wind. Then her legs gave out and she dropped to her knees on my porch. "Vanity turned me into someone I don't recognize," she said, sobbing. "I know I don't deserve anything from you. I'm sorry for erasing you. For trading you for a fantasy." I stood over her for a long moment. Part of me wanted to leave her out there. But the war was over, and there wasn't much left to win. I pulled her up by the shoulder and brought her inside, sat her by the fire, and handed her an old photo of our family from before any of this started. "We were happiest when we had nothing," I told her, pouring her a cup of tea. "I'll release enough from the trust to cover your basic needs. Not luxury. Enough." 4 months later, the wedding went ahead, smaller, quieter, and genuinely warm in a way it never would have been before. My mother had spent the weeks leading up to it tracking down Irene, the waitress, taking the bus downtown to apologize in person and hand her a tip built from her new, modest allowance. She learned to cook her own meals and clean her own house. The shock of losing everything had, strangely, saved her. I arrived at the venue in my dress uniform, not a borrowed gown. 2 silver stars caught the light on my shoulders. Rows of medals sat on my chest, proof of a life spent earning every bit of what I had. The room went quiet the moment I walked in, the same kind of quiet, but for entirely different reasons this time. Diana Ashford pressed herself against the wall as I passed. Charles crossed the floor and shook my hand again, and this time everyone in the room understood exactly what that handshake meant. I took my place in the front row, beside my humbled mother and my glowing sister, exactly where I belonged. Nobody whispered. Nobody smirked. The fragile hierarchy my mother had spent a year building out of borrowed money had been replaced by something that couldn't be bought. I squeezed both their hands as the ceremony began, feeling something real settle back into a family that had nearly destroyed itself over an illusion. Looking down at the medals on my chest, I understood something my father must have known all along: real power was never about making people kneel. It's about pulling them out of the wreckage they made and giving them the chance to stand back up on their own.